thanks for being here today. We have a lot we can talk about, I think, but this conversation is going to be about the forgiveness of sins. And so I'm going to start pretty easy. Why do we need forgiveness?
Very simply, because we've transgressed. And Luther put it that our worst transgression was the one we inherited.
And what do you mean by that?
From Adam, original sin, and he put it at the top of the important list. I never would have had the wisdom to do that. Everything else just followed out of that.
Yeah, the original sin being wanting to be God.
Yep.
Which is the chief sin.
Yeah.
It's wanting to dethrone him and displace him and be your own God.
And we've not stopped with that sin.
No.
We've not innovated on it at all.
No, we didn't just inherit it. We were like actively doing it.
Yeah.
And we reenact the fall every day.
Yeah. G.K. Chesterton said there's one article of faith in the Christian faith that's empirically observable every day in any town or city. And of course, he meant that.
Yeah.
Well, anybody who has children knows this very quickly. It doesn't take long for them to show evidence of it.
Yep.
I didn't have to teach my son to, look back in rebellious ways at me when he was doing something he knew he shouldn't do.
Yep.
Our kids want our job in the same way that we want God's job.
Yeah.
There's that famous joke that says, "What's the big difference between God and humanity? God never thinks he's you."
Yeah.
That's the main difference, right? And that's the original sin. And that's the thing for which ultimately that we need forgiveness.
Yeah.
We've lusted after God's position and his power and his authority and his sovereignty in a million and myriad of ways.
Yeah. And the outflow of that is just a myriad of different sins. As Paul says, one of the things that Paul says, it's interesting when he's talking about that he gives this litany of sins. And one of them is inventors of evil.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like you're like making stuff up at this point, like inventing new ways to be horrible.
Yeah.
Yes.
Approving of others who do.
Yes.
Yeah, it sounds great.
Yeah.
I think if one had a Bible help or you knew how to use our computer, you could, if you searched on forgiveness of sins in the New Testament, find that's the equivalent of the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
And that isn't the way I'd think about it, but Paul does.
Yes.
It's the equivalent of the gospel, being forgiven for sin.
You also asked, why do we need forgiveness? Well, there is also the reality that, we live in a world that is absolutely, in some way or another, aware that they are at least not living up to even their own standards.
Yep.
And so people walk around with a lot of guilt, burdened by a lot of shame. Even if they're not thinking specifically in terms of I've offended a holy God or I've broken his commandments, there's still this weight that people are carrying. And so you'll even see it in a ton of secular literature or film where forgiveness is a big theme because it's, like it or not, be offended by it or not, there's something inside of us that knows we need it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the practical part of it, right? We can talk about it theologically that we all need it. We've inherited sin and so we have to be forgiven, but then practically we all know that as well if we're really honest with ourselves.
Yeah, I think I heard a decade ago or so, there was a radio program in New York where people were invited to call in and confess. Had nothing to do with Christianity as far as I know, but that need to confess comes from this.
We can't get away from it. And there's all sorts of anonymous confession boards on the internet where you can do that now. And, the sad thing about that, of course, is that the person is trying to get this weight off. And so you can go online and find horrendous things that people are confessing, but they have no one to absolve them. They have no one to tell them and deliver to their ears that they are indeed forgiven. And that's the crucial difference here is we actually have good reason to believe that we have the real deal. We actually have deliverance for real sinners.
And we're getting there. So I want to ask another question. How is forgiveness made possible?
Well, it's through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Ultimately, Jesus has lived the life that I refuse to live.
Yep.
And then
lived it for you.
Yeah. And then he's died the death that I deserve.
Uh-huh.
And then he's risen out of my punishment. He's defeated the grave. He's defeated the clutches of the devil.
Yep.
He's defeated all of it. So he's done what I couldn't do. He's gotten what I deserve. He's taken the punishment, and he's proven that it's been paid, because the empty tomb is the giant CVS receipt that
Yes.
speaks volumes that it has been accepted, right?
Yes.
And so I mean, the short and sweet Sunday school answer is because of the person and the work of Jesus. He did it all.
And to be even more offensive, we know of nothing in the New Testament to go around that. It's like science. The physicists' Bible is the real world.
Mm-hmm.
And in the same way here, it has borders to it. And the borders are Jesus' death and resurrection.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's obviously spot on. My next question kind of follows up on that. What actually happens? We've talked about the need for absolution, and people are looking for it. But what actually happens when we receive God's forgiveness? What do we get?
Well, there are a whole string of words we associate with Lent. I think of Leon Morris's The Apostolic Preaching of the Cross back in the late 50s. A study of the words associated with the cross. Substitution, redemption, justification, adoption, propitiation. I think that's the best way to go at it. What do these words mean? Sproul was a great advocate of word studies, and it sounds totally theoretical. But if you do it in this case, what happened on the cross and how does it work, you do get to the guts of it.
Yeah. And the way that, the way the scriptures talk about it as far as how it affects us, that we're now at peace with God.
Mm-hmm.
Objectively speaking. And so no matter how you might feel in any given moment, that is the reality, because you have been forgiven on account of what Christ has done. You are reconciled to God. In other words, the ransom has been paid. Mm-hmm. Again, going back to Leon Morris's The Apostolic Preaching of the Cross, he spends a lot of time showing that indeed the reason Jesus is worthy to grant forgiveness to us or provide forgiveness is because he indeed pays a debt. Mm. And the debt is, of course, the debt that our sin accrues. And so that is why we can be forgiven. And as a result, now the relationship is restored. The relationship that was lost in Eden is now restored 100-fold. And we are now sons and daughters of the King rather than enemies of the King.
Yeah. But I think what's lost often in our conversation about this, and I don't know why, because it's so mind-blowingly awesome, is just the extravagance in Christ's payment. Not only that he would pay for my sins, as if that wasn't enough, but that the whole world is reconciled to God the Father through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Yeah. Whether you know it or not, whether you've received it yet or not, the whole world is reconciled to God through Jesus Christ. Every single person who's here in this conversation, who's ever lived and breathed, has been paid for, lived and died and resurrected for in Jesus Christ. And so the question is has it been applied to you, right? And has it touched your life? And have you received the overwhelming weight of that generosity in your own life, which of course brings us to things like baptism.
Right.
Yeah. Or in the Lord's Supper in Lutheran congregations, it's not weird at all for the guy to say to you, take and eat, this is the body of Christ given into death for your sin, or take and drink, this is the blood of Christ shed for you for the forgiveness of sin. And he can add my name if he knows it.
Yeah.
Take and eat, Rod.
Yeah. We practice communion every week at the church I serve, and I know the names of the vast majority of people, or most of the time I remember. Sometimes I forget because I'm imperfect. But as they're coming forward, I've had so many people tell me, I love the fact that you offer communion every week, but I really love that you tell me it's for me by name.
Here it is.
It's for me by name.
Yep.
Body for me, the blood shed for me by my name.
Yep. And in our circles, that's not weird.
No. That's called delivering the goods.
Yep.
And this is good news, but the reality is that we all still kind of don't want it, right? Forgiveness is something we think, I think Paul said this yesterday, forgiveness is something we think that we want until it's at our doorstep. Why is that? Why is it so offensive to us?
Well, as these two explained, we basically want to go into the God business ourselves and probably think we can do it better. So anything about sin is offensive to us by nature.
Yeah.
We're children. I'm a son of Adam. My daughter's a daughter of Eve. That's who we are. And it was from the very beginnings of us. And we come in already opposed to anything that says we're less than perfect. Goodness gracious. Yes. And opposed to needing anything, thank you very much. I love it in our culture where people use the word mistakes. Won't use the word sin.
Yeah.
But I've made some mistakes, I know.
Followed by, I don't regret anything at all.
Yeah.
No
Or-
regrets.
Yeah.
Well, the reason that forgiveness, we don't want forgiveness is because confession is what precedes forgiveness, and nobody wants to do that. We want to spend our lives figuring out who's good and who's bad. I mean, so if you took, there's very few people that if you took them and said, are you in the 50th percentile of good or bad people? Like if you split all of humanity right down the middle, would you be on the good? Are you more good or more? Very few people are going to say, I'm on the bad end.
Yep.
Yeah.
But 100% of people think they're in the 50% of the best people because they don't want to confess. And that's how and even evangelism becomes this message of reconciliation where people, whether they believe in God or not, or whether they subscribe to his law and his requirements or not, are walking around feeling guilt and feeling ashamed. I've talked to people like this. They say, I don't believe in God. I'm like, well, have you ever, and I don't think I need forgiveness from him. I say, have you ever apologized to anyone? Have you ever had to say to somebody, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that? Or I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that? Whatever it is. And they say, oh, of course. Like, then you do need forgiveness. It's an admission that you have failed to live up to something. But even if it's your own standard.
Yep.
I think there's also, I mean, just in general, an aversion to grace. And I think this is spans all cultures. I mean, there's a sense in, you scratch my back, I scratch your back. We say even grace erases all that and says, no, I'm going to do all of it. And we're prone to being very skeptical of that for understandable reasons. And so when the message is God forgives you entirely, gratis, it's all done, you don't have to do anything. It's why so often I've heard the question right after, okay, so what do you want me to do?
Yep.
No, I literally am saying like it's done. But okay, good. That's great. What do you want me to do? We're just sort of programmed to always want to go there. Because we're used to trying to pay back everything.
Yep.
And this message doesn't allow that.
This is what if you look at what happens when you receive forgiveness and you ask God, what should I do now? Like, how can I pay you back? You don't do anything for him. He just tells you to go forgive someone else.
Yep.
Yeah. Give some to your neighbor.
Yeah.
I was speaking in Birmingham, Alabama at the Cathedral of the Advent years ago. And in the give and take and Q&A, a lawyer stood up and he said, I'm new to this whole business. He meant Christianity. I'm brand new to it. What do you recommend that I do? And my answer was, start by doing absolutely nothing. It'll be hard, but start that way. Attend church where the gospel's preached, and it is here. And do a study to begin with of the words associated with the cross that you were just talking in Leon Morris or some source like that. Just find out what the words mean, but don't do anything yet. Yeah. Doing is your enemy.
Yeah.
That's not a message too often preached from at least American pulpits.
No.
Doing is your enemy.
Yeah.
But it needs to be preached more.
Well, there's this constant desire in us to be in control of our own lives in every capacity, right?
Yeah.
And one of the reasons that I know for me personally that forgiveness is offensive, even as a guy who's grown up in the Christian faith and pastors a church, is because it constantly takes control out of my hands. And it is this constant turning over of myself to something other than myself. And it's an act of a life of confession as a life of weakness, a life of confession as a life of surrender. A life of confession is a life of meekness. It's a life of being in touch with my own poverty at every possible moment, and handing that over to God. And then he gives me grace upon grace upon grace, and he constantly shows me his crucified and resurrected son, right? But it is a life of constantly turning over my lust and thirst to command my own existence to someone else. And that does not play well in me. It doesn't play well in our culture. And our culture is like right now, like drunk on the idea of self-actualization, where you can unlock your greatest potential just by, finding the right diet, dating the right person, trying hard enough. You can become the best version of yourself, which is like the exact opposite of the Christian message, right?
And should be called that.
It is the exact opposite of the Christian message. Our world right now says you will be a deity if you just do enough. And no wonder that people are walking around just with a desire to harm themselves, and with their heads down and with their hearts broken. And the gospel comes along, and it's at once freeing, but at first blush offensive, because it takes the tools that you've been using to try and craft your own salvation out of your hands. And it's got to do that work and leave you empty-handed, and then it sets you free, right? And we don't want to let go. We don't want to let go.
That's the offense of Luther saying that the whole life of the Christian is one of repentance. The whole life of the Christian is turning away from yourself and what you can merit and what you can do and your own perceived goodness, and turning to Christ every day. But that's a very weak move, it seems. Surely I can have one day where I could do something.
It doesn't seem progressive enough.
No,
darn it.
Ferdy says that forgiveness is the ultimate judgment, which I think is interesting, because judgment goes both ways, which is what we've kind of been talking about. It's saying you cannot do anything, and I've done everything for you. And it's that first part that I think people fight against, which leads me to ask, how do we actually offer forgiveness to our neighbor, which is something Dan mentioned, is commanded of us once we've been forgiven?
Well, I think all of us could go on and on about that, and it's not that it wouldn't be biblical, every sentence of it. But the part that concerns me in a paganized culture, the Greek word is krisis. One part of that we understand by nature. We know it from childhood on, being judged for having done something we ought not to have done. But being repented, turned from self to Christ, is also a krisis. It just is a good one. But we don't think of it as a judgment when it's a good one. But biblically it is.
Judgment's not always a bad word.
That's right. I forgive you is one example of it. Or the one that always comes to my mind is the prodigal son. I worry about I'm the second son, but that's another story. The prodigal who went away ended up completely bereft, foreign land, broke, not even enough to eat, sets up his speech and goes back ready to recite his speech, which he never gets started doing. And he's forgiven and restored, and here's from mercy even to grace, and as re-inheritized. He gets it all again.
It's amazing.
That's extravagant.
Yeah.
Right?
You dwell on that, and just maybe you might be able to extend that to your neighbor, that kind of mercy.
Spill over.
I mean, I don't think it can happen ever apart from our own forgiveness. Jesus talks about those who have been forgiven much, love much. And there is a sense in which the more we're utterly aware of how much God has forgiven us, the more we just might be prone to extending a little wink of grace towards the people that have done us wrong.
And there's no getting around a death when it comes to giving grace and mercy and forgiveness. Not just in our relationship with God, but in our interactions with others. I mean, forgiveness always comes at a cost. Someone will have to die. In order for me to give you what you don't deserve but desperately need, I'm going to have something in me die.
Yeah.
My desire to do what I'd like to do.
Yep.
My desire to give you what you deserve.
Yeah.
My desire to not have to care about your problems or your pain.
Yep.
My desire to demand justice rather than mercy. All that's going to have to die. There's no way of getting out of this without blood being shed in some, at least metaphorical sense. So in order for there to be mercy and grace given to my neighbor, something's going to have to give. Something's going to have to die. And guess what? It's the person in the position of power, the person who can give the mercy, who can proclaim the forgiveness. And that is how we love our neighbor, the way God the Father, in and through the Son, Jesus Christ, loves us.
Another thing I think is in any of these conversations we're thinking about, we Americans are doers. Boy, are we doers. And the basic reason for all of this wonderful stuff isn't primarily to improve you in your relationship. It'll do it. Luther had no doubt about that. But that is the reason. The reason is to get me into heaven.
Yeah.
Christianity isn't primarily about living. It's about dying. Now, as that has been given to us and the preaching of the gospel convinces that's been given to us, that loosens up, I think, our tenseness about improving. That's one that, I think in the American is almost unkillable.
Yeah.
What'll it do for me? What's going to be the result? Give me the bottom line.
Yeah. Give me something I can take to work with me on Monday morning.
That's right.
Or it's not worth my time.
Yeah, I don't think I have any of that you're looking for, but I can tell you, if you die tonight, you're headed for heaven.
Which, trust me, in the end, you'll be very happy about.
Yeah. Yeah. May not be immediate, but you'll be thankful then.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's good. Thanks so much for talking today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah.